Welcome again to our series on discipleship. This is now the 12th lesson, and the 12th lesson is the enjoyment of discipleship. Matthew 13 will be our reading, and we will read just a portion of Matthew 13, but really do a flyover of the entire chapter. There's a series of books in the United States and maybe throughout the world, and it's the series of any particular topic. It says for dummies. So you can have, as a true nerd, I was trying to figure out the best way to run a meeting, and at least in the West, in the global West, and in a lot of parliamentary groups, we'll use what's called Robert's Rules of Order. And Robert's Rules of Order establish, okay, when you come to a meeting, what are the ground rules of the meeting? How do we make decisions in an orderly way and protects the interests of the minority? And so I picked up a book called Robert's Rules for Dummies. And there's a certain aspect to it that we admit, yes, we're a dummy on this topic, and we want to know more. So we ask questions about what this big topic is. And you can get almost any topic for dummies. And it helps us to understand a little bit better that topic by bringing us through some of the basics and asking some of the basic questions. And then we can feel more at ease. Well, one of the big, broad subjects that maybe Matthew 13 is like a for dummies book is the kingdom for dummies. And we need this book because as I've read through the Gospels, and I've taken this year in my own personal devotions to just spend time drilling down into the Gospels, and I wanted to get to know and see Jesus, how he operated when he was on earth, and the words that came out of his mouth as he was walking on earth to people, and just seeing his conduct. And one of the top things that strikes me is how often Jesus and the writers of the Gospels talk about the kingdom. And then when I compare that to how often I grew up hearing about the kingdom, or how often the American church speaks of the kingdom, it just seems like there's this huge discrepancy and there's this huge divide. And maybe that's because kingdom is such a big thing, such a broad thing, that we don't talk about it because we don't get it. And we don't understand it. But if it is so prominent in the gospel messages, then we need to ask some questions about it. We need to learn some of the basics about it. And when it comes down to it, that's the enjoyment of discipleship, is the kingdom. That there is a kingdom that is here and coming. That is where we're going to be spending an eternity. And so we're going to let Jesus teach us about the kingdom. Again, all learning begins when the unknown is explained in terms of the known. And so you'll use this perhaps in your own teaching where you use analogies, where you say, okay, whatever this vague concept that you don't get is like, and then you use an ordinary thing that they're familiar with. And Jesus does that exactly. Jesus uses that with parables. He uses objects, activities, and lessons that his audience would have understood. Jesus uses 7 of them in Matthew 13 to explain to his disciples then and there, and those of us here and now who want to follow him, what the kingdom is like. He tells his disciples why he uses these stories, and that's where we start our reading in verse 10. We're going to read verses 10 through 17. Matthew 13. The disciples came to him and asked, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" And he replied, "The knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. And that is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they've closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For I tell you the truth, many prophets and righteous men longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Jesus says he uses these stories to distinguish who is going to see and hear and who has become calloused. Speaking in this way, speaking in these figures of speech, has a way of defining and distinguishing and separating. Those who really want to know, those who are seeking, are the ones who will really come to know and understand. Those who don't care to know, those who are not truly interested, will instead be left outside. The question then comes to us in terms of how much we can control, in terms of how much we can seek. Are we really seeking? Are we interested in knowing more? Are we like those of us who go and who get that book from the library that says this, golf for dummies, fishing for dummies, computers for dummies? Do we want to know more? Do we want to understand more about this? We're going to look at all 7 parables today because Jesus gave them all at one time, and because there are 7, which symbolizes in the Bible perfection, completion. And the 7 parables are meant to fully describe the kingdom and to fill out one complete picture of what the kingdom of God is like. Because the kingdom of heaven is glorious, it's something that we should grab for. It's something we should try to be investigating and knowing more about and discerning more on ourselves. Why else would Jesus be telling his followers so often about the kingdom of heaven if he wasn't encouraging them to seek it? Seek his kingdom and his righteousness, Jesus says. It's what ought to be paramount in our minds. This is what we ought to try to understand more and look forward to more and enjoy even as it is right now in our lives. Jesus knew they had questions. Maybe they didn't even know they had some of these questions. And questions that you also might have. And so we'll introduce each parable with a question. And then there's the one main thought that parable gives about the kingdom. So first of all, good question, what is the kingdom about? First question, what is the kingdom really about? And Jesus, in the open of chapter 13, uses the picture of a farmer. He tells about a farmer who just scatters his seed all over the field, whether it be on the hard, worn path, whether it be among the rocks, whether it be among thorn bushes already grown up, and then on good, fertile soil. Only the seed falling on that good soil produces anything. So we might think the parable is about the soils and about having hearts that accept the seed, the good news message of the kingdom, according to verse 18, and to let it grow in our lives. And though there is certainly truth to that, it's not the point of the parable. The parable is talking about the seed. The parable points to the power of the seed to reproduce itself. And the good news of the message certainly spreads and grows and reproduces, as we've seen over the last 2,000 years. And yet that even is still not the main point. The good news powerfully spreads because it is about the King of the kingdom. The point is that the kingdom is personal. It's about the person of the King, King Jesus, the sower in the parable. Just like every plant gets its genetic makeup from its seed, so every kingdom reflects the character of its king. A good, fair, kind, and generous king will then have that be reflected in his kingdom. His kingdom will be good and just and merciful and bounteous. A bad king will then produce a bad kingdom. And the good news is that the King of heaven came to earth to sow the good news that men, women, and children could enter into his kingdom. They could enter into his kingdom by accepting and believing in him and what he says. Like the sower, Jesus sows far and wide in all different types of soil. Whether it be Jew, Gentile, rich, poor, educated or uneducated, religious, non-religious, the kingdom of heaven is about being with the King. and being connected to Him and having a personal relationship with Him. We enter the kingdom of heaven by knowing and loving King Jesus. So do you know and love Him? Do the people that you work with know and love Him? What is the kingdom about? The kingdom is about the King. The kingdom is personal. There's a second parable in verses 24 through 30. It's this parable about wheat and weeds. This might answer questions like, where is the kingdom? Who's in the kingdom? If Jesus is a good king, why is there still so much evil in the world? This parable tells us that. Second, the kingdom has no parameters. The kingdom has no parameters. It is a boundless kingdom. And sometimes people mistakenly equate the kingdom with the church itself. But if that's the case, then we might think that this parable is saying we should let everyone join the church. Believers, unbelievers, weeds, fruitful, godly, ungodly people. And we certainly want to welcome everyone who wants to know about Jesus and let them come to worship and let them hear the gospel week in, week out. But the parable teaches that the kingdom is bigger than the church. It includes the church, but this is more than the church. The kingdom is wherever the king rules, and King Jesus rules the universe. If you love and depend on Jesus, then the kingdom of heaven is within you, and it goes where you go. Jesus is your king. Jesus wants to rule in you, in every part of you, and through you. It's even larger than people even. For example, for children, if children love Jesus, then He goes to school with them, and He's with them in their sports, and He's with them in their group of friends, and He's with them when there are problems in their family. The influence of the kingdom has no parameters. It has no boundaries, no limits. So the kingdom has no parameter, and its influence is everywhere. Then why at times does it seem so powerless, so small, so impotent, so unimportant? Why don't people everywhere acknowledge the true kingship of Jesus? And he answers those kinds of questions in verses 31 and 32, where the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. What that means is, third, that the kingdom is potent, but in a particular kind of way, in the way of a seed. It's important to reflect on the fact that the kingdom is like a seed, and its potency is like the potency of a seed. A seed, any seed, like here, the small mustard seed, it grows, but it grows slowly. It has a certain amount of power, but it begins slowly, quietly, without even looking like it even. But then eventually that acorn grows into a huge oak tree, and it has power and has potential. Think of all the power that is inside that seed that looks so powerless and so boring. But think of all the genetic info and all the potential that's lying inside that seed. The kingdom of heaven may seem small sometimes and in some places, but it has potential. It has the power, and it is growing even when you don't know it, and even when you don't see it. And it eventually can change its environment drastically. It means that the kingdom of heaven has potential to expand within you and within your family, within your entire culture. Just as yeast permeates all the dough, but yeast is often used by the Lord as an illustration of evil. Seeds are multiplying. Every plant has the ability to reproduce. Again, that's the power. That's what's so good. I'm so glad that you're taking this discipleship course, because that's what discipleship is all about. The fact that each plant reproduces seeds. And in that way, you have this growth. It's amazing in the area that I live in here in South Dakota. It's cut diagonally in half by the Missouri River, and the Missouri River, most of the state is high prairie. It's very flat, but then as soon as you come to the Missouri River, you have these beautiful rolling river hills. Now, on one side of the river, there used to be these cedar trees. And the cedar trees were on one side, but eventually the birds picked up the acorns from those cedar trees and flew across the river and dropped them on the other side. And now the other side is filled with cedar trees. Cedar trees. A lot of ranchers hate it. They don't like it at all because cedar trees make grazing and herding next to impossible. But you see the power of multiplication. I saw a picture from the 60s of these river hills, and all it was just grassy, beautiful rolling hills. Well, now if you go out there, it's just covered in cedar trees, and that's happened just gradually over time. You see these little trees that are starting up. The power of multiplication, the power of the spread, and that's the power of the gospel. The kingdom has so much more potential, but why then? Next question, why don't we see more results? Why don't we see more results? Why don't we see this great spread that I see in the South Dakota river hills? Well, there's a fourth comparison, a fourth parable in verse 33 that says the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that gets mixed through a batch of dough. Like I said, in many places in Scripture, yeast is an illustration of evil, but here it's different. Yeast is described in verse 33. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a large amount of flour until it worked all through the dough. The kingdom of heaven permeates everything it touches with the character of Jesus. Just like yeast works its way into all the dough, the character of Jesus. The kingdom of heaven permeates everything it touches with the character of Jesus. The mustard seed shows the extensive growth of the kingdom. The yeast shows the intensive, so not the extensive growth, but the intensive growth that happens inside each person who loves and follows Jesus. You can't see the yeast when it's working, but we can see its results. We can see the growth. We can't see the kingdom of heaven inside people, but we can see the changes that it produces over time. And maybe you love Jesus and you want so badly to see change in your life. You want so badly to see change in attitudes or habits, values, but you're just not seeing a lot right now. And that can be really disheartening. But don't worry, because Jesus' influence in you is permeating, even when we don't know it. Just like yeast, it's working its way into you. And over time, perhaps you'll look back and you won't be able to see how you changed yesterday or the day before, but weeks down the road, you'll see, oh, I am different than I was on that day. And this is powerful because many people who are not believers believe that you can't change. I hear it all the time. People don't change. He is who he is, and he always will be that way. And people try to change, and they want to change, and they would love to change, but then at the end of the day, they find that they can't. This is the only true way to change. This yeast that works its way, the character of Jesus working its way into our being. So I hope you're able to see the beginning of this enjoyment of discipleship. It's the kingdom working its way into our lives and spreading into those who we follow and those who we try to teach. Jesus makes a fifth comparison in verse 44. Here he says the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure. It's like a treasure buried in a field. One day a man, maybe a hired hand, maybe a migrant worker, happens to be digging in the field and he's shoveling, and then suddenly it hits clunk. He's found something hard. Something's been buried there, and he digs around it and he realizes he's found a treasure, someone else buried there. Maybe someone during a war buried this treasure and then they were never able to come back and pick it up. And so he covers it up. What does he do? He covers it up. But does he forget about it? No, he doesn't forget about it. He doesn't just move on. He sells everything he has to buy that field. It's one of my favorite parables. He sells everything he has and he buys that particular field because he's got to have that particular treasure. And maybe nobody knows why in the world he would pay that much for that piece of ground. We still have jokes about this. If somebody buys a piece of ground and it seems like they overpaid for it, or they pay way too much of it, or they seem like they're way too eager, you'll hear other people saying, is there some buried treasure there that I don't know about? Is there maybe oil underneath that piece of ground that we're unaware of? Because that's what the man's doing right here. He doesn't even think it's a sacrifice. When he buys that field, he doesn't think, oh man, shoot, what a poor investment. It's worth whatever he gave up. It is worth it to give up anything. The kingdom is priceless. That's the next attribute that Jesus is teaching us about the kingdom. It's priceless. Jesus' answer to anyone who might be wondering, is being in the kingdom of heaven worth my leaving this group, worth leaving that club? Is it worth learning more about the kingdom of heaven? Is that worth giving up time on the computer or time, whatever other interests I had before? Is my investment really worth it? The time that's required. Is it worth it to make disciples? Because it's going to cost time. It's going to cost maybe other relationships that you think, boy, I'd rather invest in that particular person, but there's this person who's hoping to become a disciple of Jesus. And Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is priceless. You can't put a price tag on it. It's worth more than anything we might give up to get it. Verses 45 and 46 are similar. Look similar to the previous parable, but there is a difference. In that story, the man stumbled on the treasure by accident, but here, the merchant pursues the pearl on purpose. So the treasure was found on accident, but the merchant pursues the pearl on purpose. So Jesus is saying the kingdom of heaven here is worth pursuing. This adds to the idea of the kingdom being priceless. We may stumble into the kingdom. We may find it when we're not looking for it, but once you do hear about it, and once you realize its value, then Jesus is saying, then you pursue it. From then on, we must have it. We throw everything we are into acquiring it, knowing it, and possessing it. Do you want to pursue King Jesus? Is that what really motivates you? Is that what intrigues you? I hope that's maybe something you'll talk about with each other. I remember talking with a teacher at one point, a much older pastor, and he said something that really struck me where he said, everybody should be able to say quickly, every Christian ought to be able to share why Jesus is so precious to them. That might be a good thing for you to share with each other. What makes Jesus so precious? Why is he so precious to us? Why is he so valuable? Why is he worth pursuing? Now, the seventh and last parable here in this chapter is about fishing. Of course, Jesus, his disciples were fishermen, so they certainly understood the fishing parables. It's a fishing with a net and catching all kinds of fish, and some that the fishermen keep and some that they throw away. What's Jesus' point here? Some are kept, some are thrown away. Well, the kingdom of heaven, in the end, will be pure. In the end, the kingdom will be pure. This parable answers such questions as, will there ever be a time when things are really better? Will evil be dealt with? Will the wrong eventually be cast out? Will I be free from my own sin and even the consequences of my own past sinful choices? Will there be a time when there's no more sorrow and sadness and pain and death? And the parable gives a resounding yes. That's the kingdom. There will be a time when Jesus as king is all in all, and he rules over everything, when the devil is done, when the rebellion is vanquished, when sin is separated from us, and we can enjoy that only if we are in the kingdom. And so are you grabbing for the kingdom? Are you grabbing for the kingdom with all you are and with all that you have? 4 points to ponder. Which of the parables and its explanation is especially pertinent to you right now? Maybe there's one story that really sticks out to you. Like I said, the parable of the hidden treasure is one that really sticks out to me. Increasingly so as I go into ministry and as I do ministry, the parable of the mustard seed is one that I take a special comfort in, especially during times of discouragement. Believing that the mustard seed, things don't happen overnight, but good things happen over time. Do you think that the main point of the parable of the sower is correct? I said that the main point of the parable of the sower is not about the seed and it's not about the soils, but it's about the sower. Do you think that that's correct? Why or why not? Why do you want to be in the kingdom of the King? That's the third point to ponder. Why do you want to be in the kingdom of the King? And fourth, what have you given up for it? And would you say that was a good deal? What have you given up for the kingdom of the King? And would you say that was a good deal? It can be a very encouraging thing for you to share with each other. Principles to practice. What story might you tell to help a friend better understand the kingdom of heaven? As Jesus taught in parables, so also when we are going about the task of discipleship, it's so often helpful to put things in the terms of the people who we're working with so that they can understand and so that they can know. What does Jesus say about the kingdom in Matthew 6:33? It's another principle to practice. What does Jesus say about the kingdom in Matthew 6:33? Where is the kingdom in your list of pursuits? That's the third. Where is your kingdom? Where is the kingdom in your list of pursuits? And fourth, how can you help the person you are discipling to want the kingdom more? We can only make somebody want something so much, but Jesus is showing us that you can present something in a way that makes somebody want something more. How can we present the kingdom of God in a way that makes people want it more? Thank you for joining once again. That was the 12th lesson, the enjoyment of discipleship. We move to the 13th lesson and Luke 14 next time. We'll see you then.